Why hello, my fellow apes. I hope you are well. I am joined by Alex O'Connor, Cosmic Skeptic, and, well, we've just filmed a video for your channel, and luckily I managed to convince you to drop Christianity. Like, I'm happy that you're back on the dark side. We've got cookies.
That's going to be very confusing out of context to anybody who hasn't seen the other video.
Well, that's the reason. Go watch it.
Yeah, the inaugural episode of the Cosmic Christian podcast.
Yeah.
Suffice to say that I'm now back to being Cosmic Skeptic again, but yeah, go and check it out. Also, I was glad to let you do the intro to your own channel, but I have to say, sat here with this background, I just if you'll indulge me for a moment.
Do it.
Why, hello, my fellow apes. I hope you are well.
You know what? I'm going to start playing that at the beginning of my videos.
Yeah.
And just no context, just put that out.
It's cathartic. Yeah. It's cathartic.
So, me and you got into this atheist movement, if we want to call it that, or just philosophy in general, around the same time. And at that beginning, 4 years ago or so?
5, I think.
5,
now.
yeah. We had conversations about free will, about nihilism, about morality, and what I thought would be cool is to go, look, I've been a YouTuber for quite some time. I've been interacting with the literature. I've been interacting with theists. And you've had the fortune of going through the academy, university. And so you've been exposed to some of the greatest Christian minds that there are, and some of the greatest philosophy being taught by people that really understand it. And I thought, hey, let's have a conversation. Let's readdress some of the major things that we agreed and disagreed with, and just basically see where you are at the moment. So, yeah, thanks for coming on. I've got a set of questions, and we'll go from there. All right. So the first question is, what was the last time that you changed your mind on a philosophical topic, and why?
You mean apart from my recent conversion and then deconversion to Christianity for about an hour and 20 minutes?
Yeah, we're on April 1st.
On April 1st.
Yeah, we're left for that side. Yeah.
Coincidentally.
Make up your own words.
Coincidentally.
Just make them up, mate.
That's what the atheist community seem to do. That's my second point. I think, well, jokes aside, I think that I got a lot of flack recently for saying that the word atheism in the context of like academic philosophy or like essay writing, this kind of stuff, atheism tends to be defined as the belief there is no God. Colloquially, most atheists that I know, certainly in the YouTube space, define atheism as a lack of belief in God, which, of course, people are welcome to do. You can define words as you please, but in my view, definitions are descriptive rather than prescriptive. They're just supposed to describe how people use particular words. That's what dictionaries do. And so in a kind of philosophical dictionary like the SEP or something, which is dealing with entries from academic philosophers, it makes sense to define atheism as the belief there is no God, because that's how most academic philosophers, I think, define it. But when we're talking on YouTube, or when we're having a debate on a radio station with an apologist, because I don't think either of us believe there is no God, we just don't believe that there is a God, we lack a belief.
I think I'd go further now.
Oh, really? So you'd be a positive atheist?
I think so, yeah.
Okay, well, that's interesting. That's actually fascinating. I'd love to talk to you about that. But I mean, I wouldn't go that far. But I'd still, for the sake of kind of colloquial understanding, call myself an atheist. I'd just be careful to explain that that's what I mean in that circumstance. But I mentioned that, like, yeah, in certain contexts, I think it makes sense to define atheism as belief there is no God. And a lot of people were very upset with me for doing that. Do you feel like when you said it, you expressed it as if it was a one-way street kind of thing? Or do you reckon it's that they weren't paying attention to the fact that you were saying in philosophy? It could be kind of both, because it's like my duty to make sure I'm expressing myself properly. It was like in the context of a Q&A, so I didn't really think it was going to be that important. So I just answered it. I was just kind of like, whatever, let me just spit my thoughts out. If I knew it was going to cause such a scene, I would have maybe been a bit more careful. I can't remember exactly what I said, so I wouldn't know if but I'm pretty sure that I said that in academic philosophy, which is also, people kind of accuse me of being a bit of a ponce or elitist, being like, oh, well, you and your academic philosophy, you can take that definition. That's not what, everybody else uses. But like, most of the time I'm not doing academic philosophy. I'm not an academic philosopher. I'm essentially a polemicist and a YouTuber. I've just gone to university where I've got to meet academic philosophers and notice that they define atheism that way. I don't. I mean, on my personal statement applying to university, I called myself an agnostic atheist, meaning a lack of belief in God. So like, that's always how I've defined myself on the colloquial level. But if you're discussing this with someone who thinks atheism is belief there is no God, then fine, I'm just not an atheist, right?
Yeah, I do remember when you made the video, because I actually got quite a lot of messages on like lots of my most recent videos saying, Steve, you got to deal with this. I'm like, dude, like he's just expressing like the academic view. There's a book down there from Graham Oppy called The Basics of Atheism. Graham Oppy gives like 4 distinctions. I think broadly, in the philosophical literature it's good. And just in case people are interested in why philosophers do this, it's because if you define a proposition by one's epistemic state, then you can't effectively talk about it, because you're talking about someone's belief in a proposition or lack thereof. Whereas if you're talking about something, that's ontological, something that exists, then you can say that, as you said, like descriptive of the world itself, saying that theism is the belief that there is at least one God, and atheism is the belief that there is no gods. Then you can meaningfully, in a meaningful way, use the word atheist.
Yeah, and you can contrast them.
Yeah.
They kind of meet in the middle. If atheism just describes a psychological state, fine.
Yeah.
But if theism is a proposition, then they kind of just miss each other.
They do, yeah. And if you want, you would have to like talk of like non-theism. If you'd have to find a different term. And there are like Andrew Flew, and like there's many that have come up with different definitions and different ways to do this. But I'm with you. I think
do that if you like. I just think it's like it's quite an uninteresting debate, and it's not really a philosophical question that I've changed my mind on, but just kind of like a trivial definitional point.
Fair enough.
Maybe a more interesting philosophical shift is that although I've never really been I've certainly never been. Maybe I have been a utilitarian at one point in my life, maybe when I was like 17 or 18, but at least recently I'm not a utilitarian, I'm not a strict consequentialist, but in practice, like meta-ethically, but in practice, I was living quite strictly consequentially, which is to say that if I thought that there was an opportunity to contribute even marginally to certain forms of suffering, I should avoid it if I can. So this comes up in veganism a lot. It's like, well, why should I not buy this product if it's going to have such a tiny effect on the demand or the animals that are being killed or something like this? And you say, well, look, you're still contributing, even if marginally, you're still contributing towards this great end. But there's something kind of intuitively wrong about that for me. If I walk into a room and I see a wooden chair and a leather chair, in my head I can say, well, as a vegan, right? So yeah, I've already mentioned it.
Yeah.
If I sit on the leather chair, I'm marginally contributing to the wear and tear of that chair. There's a lot of look, I'm a poet and I didn't realize it.
That's what uni's done to you.
There are a lot of like I could say, okay, so technically if I sit on that chair, it's going to marginally increase the rate at which it's going to need to be replaced or repaired or something like this. And so even if very, very marginally, I'm potentially contributing to some animal suffering there, but it seems ridiculous, right? It's like if you're walking into a room looking at those two chairs and saying, fine, if you want to sit on the chair on the wooden one, not as a moral point, but just because you think cow skin is gross or it's morally undignified or something like that, fine. But if you're taking a consequentialist approach of like, well, I don't mind sitting on the leather chair, but I'm not going to because I think it's unethical because it marginally contributes towards wearing the chair down and having it replaced more early. I just don't think that's how ethics should be done. You end up in a kind of moral paralysis. I mean, maybe a consequentialist meta-ethically might say, well, that is the correct answer to the question of which chair you should sit on.
Yeah.
But there's kind of a higher order consideration that there's negative utility in constantly trying to make those analyses all the time. So I guess I'm a little bit more lax with it. I'm a bit more like, in the way that if someone sits on the leather chair, I'm not even going to think to it's not even going to cross my mind that might be like immoral.
Right.
In the same way, when talking about veganism, of course, if you can avoid contributing towards these products, then do. But I guess I'm more relaxed about certain scenarios where, like, if something comes with a dish that you didn't order and you've got the choice to maybe send it back, it's going to be thrown away. Like these kinds of situations, I'm a bit like, look, just stop and think to yourself, is this actually how ethics should be done? Should you be sat there thinking, well, this tiny little sachet of mayonnaise, if I send it back, they might just throw it away because it's been on a dish. But then by sending it back, maybe I like give them the message that they shouldn't get it wrong again, and that will like marginally decrease the number of times that mistake is made. Is this really what it's about when you're trying to figure out how to live the good life? Is this really what we ought to be engaging in? I don't know if it's worth the time. There might be negative utility overall in getting caught up in this kind of stuff.
Well, it seems to me, That's really interesting. So it seems to me that if you take a deontological approach, then you get like these straight lines of like categorical, like nope, like always sit on the wooden chair kind of thing. But one of the strengths of utilitarianism and that perspective is that you get to weigh in different things, and you just get to look at, here's the goal, what's the best way of achieving that? And one thing to consider is, so I've personally had quite a few people turn vegetarian, and they've said to me that my vegetarianism has played a role in that. And when I've asked them why, they've all given me the same answer. They said that you just you just act out, the ethos of vegetarianism. But frankly, the way that they put it, you're not a dick about it. So, for instance, if I was to come in and say, we ordered food, and the restaurant accidentally ordered something that's, I don't know, had like a fish product on it. Now, really, I wouldn't eat it, but it's for my own mentality. Like, I don't want to taste that because I know I really like fish, and that's just, I don't want to put myself in that situation, right? And I might lose sleep over the fact of something like that. But if I didn't really care about that factor, then you could make a utilitarian argument that actually eating that and just saying, yeah, I'm a vegetarian, but like when things like this happen, like whatever, you could argue that if the goal is to minimize the suffering, then you might convince more people by, paradoxically, actually sometimes indulging in that. It becomes more relatable, and because of that, people are more open to acting it out. I think because you convince one person not to have a burger, it's probably better than you choosing to sit on that leather seat once.
Oh, certainly. So in the case of like the leather chair and stuff like that, or maybe a small product that comes on the side that you're considering sending back or not, that's probably true. I think there's kind of a line to be drawn here, because there's a point at which you don't want to be seen as morally unserious. You don't want to be seen as having this position, yeah, I'm against animal cruelty, but like, yeah, whatever, every now and again it's fine. It's like, no, I'm against this very stringently and very consistently. And like, maybe the reason why I would not send this product back, or I'd eat the leftover, is because I'm trying to show that veganism can be easy. But I think you need to be careful to make sure that there's still this undertone of seriousness, and that this doesn't apply to other situations.
Great point.
Even then, that will upset some people who think that no, like, there is no circumstance in which you can contribute to this, but they won't be consequentialists. So we're kind of talking on a utilitarian understanding here. A lot of, if you're an animal rights activist, chances are you're not a utilitarian, because utilitarians famously struggle to ground rights. They talk about suffering reduction, and so really you should be calling yourself like an animal welfareist. Problem is that in a again, like I guess colloquially or within activism and stuff, animal welfareism is seen as contrasting with like animal abolitionism. So welfareism means something like being willing to allow some animal suffering as long as it's being improved slightly smaller cages or something like that. So the word isn't very helpful, but animal rights activists, if they believe in rights as a deontological principle, are probably not going to be consequentialists. And so they're not going to like this response that we're having. But I just want to clarify that we're kind of talking, if you're a consequentialist, then yeah, this would be the case. There is one more consideration here, which this just shows that like these questions are very rarely settled, because there are often things you don't consider. So in the example, for instance, of leftover food, if I'm at a meal with someone and they leave over some animal products, I think most vegans, consequentialists or not, will say that it's probably okay to eat it. It's at least permissible to eat it. A lot of people might say that there's something undignified about eating it. There are some people who say that it's still immoral to eat that animal product, because there's just something wrong. It just plays into the notion that these animals are here for us to be eaten. You shouldn't eat it. But then consider the fact that food waste is actually quite a big environmental contributor. It contributes a lot of methane into the atmosphere, which itself will more quickly bring on an environmental crisis, which the first victims of which will be non-human animals. So by kind of leaving as much food waste as you have the opportunity to do, you're contributing to a problem that's actually going to cause more animal suffering in the long run. So even if you still don't want to eat that because it just gives us this idea that animals aren't here to be eaten, fine, but you should recognize that comes at the cost of the consequentialist argument that by allowing food waste like that to take place, or saying that it's morally obligatory to waste the food in those situations, then you're contributing to the environmental crisis, which might have a worse effect on animals than eating the leftover, because eating that leftover doesn't have an effect on animals. You think it's wrong because of what it signifies, what it plays into, this kind of stuff, which for me is very vague. When someone says, when I say that, yeah, if you came across like an egg in a field and it was just there, like, yeah, sure, eat the egg. Like, who cares? Like, no animal's going to suffer for that. Some people say to me, no, because that, and it's one of my least favorite phrases when people say this plays into. I'm not really sure what that means, but they'll say, oh, this plays into the notion that animals are here for us to consume. Like, no, it doesn't, because I don't think that they are here for us to consume.
Mm-hmm.
But the egg is there, and I'm going to eat it, and it's not going to cause any suffering. Like, I don't think they're as contradictory as people often put forwards.
Yeah.
I'm sure. I mean, there are people probably already out there planning responses to what I'm saying here.
Well, actually, yeah, I was going to say that my experience with vegan activists is that they don't have the nuanced view that you do. They actually tend to be very much like, because I've had conversations. Like, I get a lot of hate because I'm the vegetarian, right? And that's basically how you're going to get hate from both ends. And when I'm speaking with them, they don't have this nuance that you have. Rather, they will just go, "No, it's always wrong to eat." And I'm like, "But that doesn't."
Well, that's a compliment, of course. So thank you. But I would say that, like, I think you're just speaking to the wrong people. Of course, there are a great many vegans that like, Dogma is really the problem here. Dogma exists in all people, I would say, as well as all communities. It certainly exists strongly within the vegan community. As it exists within religion, as it exists among some atheists, sometimes about atheism, depending on what exactly they mean by atheism. So yeah, sure, you're going to find activists who just say, no, like, the thing that's wrong is eating a bit of chicken.
Yeah.
To me, that's nonsensical. I don't think it's wrong to eat chicken. Like, the thing that's wrong isn't the eating of the product. The thing that's wrong for me is the infliction of suffering upon an animal, or economically contributing towards the future infliction of suffering.
And that brings up your razor, doesn't it? Like, I think that's a good and succinct way of putting it. So
extraordinary harm and mistreatment require extraordinary justification.
There you go.
That's it. It's my perhaps butchering of the Sagan standard that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence.
I think it's good.
And yeah, that's my position. Now, some people might say that, no, veganism is about not eating animals. That's what it is. And if you're okay with, like, eating an animal product in any circumstance, you're not a vegan. Again, with the definitional point, fine, I'm not a vegan. Right, fine. But then I guess you kind of lose me as an advocate there. Like, I'm no longer advocating for your position of veganism, but call me what you like. I don't really care. But there's dogma all over the community. But the way you said, like, vegan activists tend not to be very nuanced. It's like, it's going to partly depend on what their goal is, because I'm not a vegan activist. At least I don't consider myself to be one. I'm an advocate for veganism. I'm not an activist, because I think activism implies kind of going out on the street, protesting, this kind of stuff.
Giving speeches.
Sometimes I do. Yeah, speeches. So maybe I understand why somebody might put that on me, but it's not like how I like to define myself.
And I also wouldn't think that's a bad thing. Like, you got activists in all sorts of areas, which I think they're doing great work.
They're necessary and fantastic, and without them, like, people like me would be totally useless. But if you talk to them, because their goal is often, like, there are vegan activists who specialize in, like, camera work and photography. There are vegan activists who specialize in producing food alternatives, or doing research into population trends and this kind of stuff. Like, if you talk to those vegan activists and you ask them for a philosophically nuanced point, maybe they're just not philosophers. Maybe that's, like, not what they're doing. So if you meet somebody who's just a vegan, and maybe they're quite active with it, maybe they're like a friend, they don't have a platform or anything, but they like to make it known, they take part in protests, and you speak to them and they come across a bit dogmatic, maybe the thinking doesn't go as deep as you'd like. Oftentimes that's because most people who are vegan are not ethicists, right? They might be activists, they might be writers, they might be communicators, they might be educators, but of course you shouldn't expect, if that's not their job, for them to be able to do it. But there are also a great body of very nuanced philosophical thinkers in the sphere. A deontological approach defended philosophically consistently. I think I have problems with it, of course, but, like, one of the best defenses comes from Gary Francione. He's quite a famous, within the vegan community, kind of abolitionist vegan communicator. There's also people like Tom Reagan, for example. Tom Reagan is often put forward as the kind of sister philosopher to Peter Singer, where Peter Singer is called the founder of the animal rights movement. He doesn't believe in rights. Peter Singer is one of the first people in the modern age to really press the point of animal suffering and that it matters. But he makes a consequentialist case. Tom Reagan makes a rights-based approach. and they're often kind of put together as the two basic starting points for each position. Like, if anyone's the founder of the animal rights movement, it would be Tom Reagan, probably, rather than Peter Singer. So like, there are plenty of philosophers that you can look at who have varying disagreeable views about all kinds of different areas of veganism, but the fact that always doesn't come out when you're talking to a vegan activist on the street doesn't mean that, well, we shouldn't take that as an indication that veganism doesn't have the nuance that I think it does.
Okay, yeah. So I totally see where you're coming from. It's like, if you take the academy, they might be defining atheism defining veganism, as we were just speaking about atheism, in a way that doesn't commit them to say, nope, eating meat in all cases is bad. But the lay people, the lay vegans, do tend to go for these other definitions that, in my opinion, are a bit problematic. Sounds like they are in yours. But the point that you express is that maybe I'm speaking to the wrong people, and that's fair.
I think that most vegans, certainly most vegans that I encounter in the YouTube space, and people who kind of do it either professionally or do it enough to be familiar with it, familiar enough to make a good argument, essentially are in line with the Vegan Society's definition, which is an elimination to the highest extent possible and practicable of all forms of animal exploitation. And, there are, like, so for instance, I don't like the word exploitation now. I prefer the word suffering for reasons we've already talked about. That seems to me the important thing. So there's a disagreement there, but most of the time there's a vague agreement on that, at least. But you will find people defining it differently in different contexts. If you work for Sainsbury's and you're in charge of marketing, then the only conception of veganism that you need to have in your mind is vegan food does not contain animal products. So to you, the word vegan just means no animal products. That's like what it means. And that's all you need if that's your job. Now, if you wanted to start talking to somebody about it, it'd be worthwhile pointing out to them, oh, just so you know, that's not really what veganism is. That's like what vegan food is. But you can understand why somebody could be perfectly competent in designing a vegan range for Sainsbury's and that be their job, but they're going to have a totally different definition or conception of what vegan means to the vegans who are going out and buying those products, right?
Yeah.
But of course, this is all just semantic. It is, call yourself a vegan if you like. I call myself a vegan because it helps get the point across. But more often, I won't say, "Hey, I'm a vegan." I'll say, like, "Hey, I don't eat animals," or something a bit more specific. And people can call me what they like after that. But dogma exists everywhere, man. I can give you an example of dogma within veganism, if you like. That happened to me recently, which is there's just to show that dogma exists everywhere, just to prove it. There's a subreddit called r/vegan circle jerk. So on Reddit, there's the Reddit, there's the vegan subreddit r/vegan, which is quite large. Lots of people post, but it's quite a friendly place. It's supposed to be there for outreach. It's supposed to bring people in and be like a happy celebratory type place. Whereas a lot of vegans, quite understandably, just are very kind of annoyed at the state of animal agriculture and just want a place to basically vent, post memes, and just be totally rude to people who eat meat, this kind of stuff, whatever. So they've got the subreddit, and it's quite funny. If you're a vegan, it's quite a funny place to go because they're just like totally unapologetic memes and material. I always thought it was quite a funny subreddit. I've done stuff, I did an Ask Me Anything on r/vegan once, and so if you look for it, you can work out which Reddit account is mine, even though it's not Cosmic Skeptic. It's just like my name.
Right. It's not Cosmic Christian either.
So it's not Cosmic Christian. People know that it's me. And so I did this video on my channel a while ago talking about the right to life for animals. It was a Q&A again. Somebody asked, what's an argument for the right to life for animals? And I said in the Q&A, well, I'm not sure non-human animals have a right to life in the way that humans do. Of course, I don't think anybody has rights. I don't think rights exist. So trivially, I don't think animals have any rights. But I thought, well, if human beings have the right to life in some conceptual sense, like a metaphorical truth, I've made a video about my understanding of rights before. I thought, well, that understanding of rights that I would have, I don't think can apply to animals. I'm still not sure what I think about that, but I thought, hey, let me put it out there. It's just a casual Q&A. No one's going to mind. So I put it out and said, I'm not sure that animals do have a right to life. And if you want to know why, you can go and watch on my YouTube channel.
Hit the link.
It's quite a fairly straightforward argument, I think. And then I didn't notice this until ages later because I never really go on Reddit. But I realized there's like an inbox and people can message you. And I looked at it and I had a message from the moderators of Vegan Circle Jerk, and they banned me. They banned me from Vegan Circle Jerk and sent me a message saying, actually, vegans do think that animals have a right to life, and we don't need a 20-minute video full of sophisms to explain why they're wrong. And I thought,
wow,
well, okay. So I was like, oh, hello. So I messaged back. I was like, oh, like, okay, what definition of veganism are you using? And I mean, do you not buy any products that deliberately kill other animals? Because it was kind of about like crop deaths and how animals, sometimes accidentally, but sometimes purposely are killed in crop production. Now, of course, it's better to eat the crops because it kills less animals than growing more crops, feeding them to livestock and eating the livestock. But I said, if animals have a right to life in the way that humans do, I can't kill you to eat, like to steal your food and eat it, even if I'm going to starve. So why should I be able to kill animals on crop farms, even if I'm going to starve, right? So I thought, hey, there's an interesting thought. And so I said, like, oh, so do you, like, what definition of veganism are you using, Mr. Moderator? And do you ever, like, buy products that harm animals in this way, that kill animals? Because, you know, how are you understanding a right to life there? And then he responded by permanently banning me. And I thought to myself, you know, like, fair play, because like what I was just saying Vegan Circle Jerk is good for, I became a victim of. It's good because they're just basically unrelenting. It's like, we think this about animal exploitation, and if you don't like it, you can sod off. And so they did that to me. But to me, that appears dogmatic.
It does, yeah.
It's like you've got a line, which is animals have a right to life, and that's it, right? And like, even if
it's non-negotiable, it's just
it doesn't really matter. I mean, some people have responded to my, I wouldn't call it an argument, but my kind of consideration here. I guess it is an argument of sorts that animals don't have rights, and they've responded quite well. Some people have said, no, you can still defend animals having a right to life in the same way that humans do, if you understand things in a particular way. And I thought that's great. Like, I don't think it's dogmatic to hold fast to a principle, but to hold fast to it regardless of any new information, or without even being willing to consider new information, and to just ban someone from a vegan subreddit because their interpretation of what veganism means doesn't align with yours, I think is dogmatic. So there's an example of the kind of thing that you're talking about. But like, if I wanted nuanced vegan philosophizing, I wouldn't go to the moderator of r/vegan circle jerk, right? So when you say, vegans that I talk to, you know, they're often quite dogmatic, like, sure, but, you know, I talk to a lot of atheists who are very dogmatic. But it would be unfair of me to say that says anything about atheism.
I guess the only thing I was really emphasizing is that when you talk to most atheists, like, they're going to give you the lacktheism definition. It feels equivalent to, like, if you talk to most vegans, do you get these, like, utilitarian, nuanced arguments? And maybe I'm wrong, but my perception is no, you don't.
I think,
and I think,
right.
Okay, fair enough. So that's where I'm coming from on there. But I will say this: I've noticed this, and it frustrates me. So it must be very frustrating for you. There's a double blind going on. If you have a nuanced view, you just get accused of he's not really principled. And if you have a principled view, they go, you're just being religiously zealous about it. And it's like, well done, you've set it up so you can't actually have a conversation with a vegan because you've defined them basically as unapproachable in both ways. And for me, that frustrates me. I see it quite a lot, and I imagine as not an activist, but, you know, a vegan content creator, or at least at times a vegan content creator, a content creator that makes some vegan content, that must be quite frustrating.
I suppose. I mean, I try not to think about it too much, because the way I see it is I'm talking to another person, and that person thinks that animal cruelty is bad. And then I'll say, okay, well, so that's like a principle that we're going to work with. Now, I'm not going to commit you to that principle, right? Like, that principle is just a placeholder for now. So that's your principle. Animal cruelty is bad. Then we can say, look, you know, okay, does factory farming cause, or I guess it would rather be unnecessary animal cruelty is bad. Maybe you're defining animal cruelty as unnecessary suffering.
Sure.
Like, okay, that's your principle. Does factory farming cause suffering to animals? Yes. Is factory farming necessary? No. Therefore, factory farming is cruel. It's unnecessary suffering, right? And so if your principle is that you're against unnecessary animal suffering or animal cruelty, and factory farming is unnecessary, and it's animal suffering and therefore cruelty, you ought to be against factory farming. In fact, indeed, you are against factory farming, or you're wrong about the principle that you hold. Yeah. Now, you can do what you like here, right? You could say, okay, yeah, no, because this principle, I do believe it very strongly, I'm against factory farming. you can also, one man's modus ponens is another man's modus
Modus
tollens,
tollens.
right? So you could also say, well, because I think factory farming is fine, maybe my principle isn't that unnecessary animal suffering is bad. And that's a line a lot of people take. They say, no, there's unnecessary animal suffering is fine, like unnecessary animal suffering occurs when we drive cars, for instance. And then it's like, okay, so what we've discovered is that your principle that was just a placeholder isn't really the principle.
Yeah.
It will do for the purpose of discussion, but that's like the principles that we abide by are really just placeholders for places we don't yet want to kind of dig any deeper on. So you dig a bit deeper and you say, so what really is the principle? Well, maybe like, I don't know, unnecessary cruelty inflicted upon animals for particular reasons, like for trivial sensory reasons, right? Rather than practical reasons like driving cars. And then you can run the same kind of consistency tests and you get to what John Rawls called a reflective equilibrium. You have these inputs of like intuitive principles and you have these outputs of the conclusions that they lead to. And it's not obvious whether if they kind of, if you should kind of adapt the principle to fit the conclusion or adapt on the basis of the conclusion, kind of adapt the...
Because you're working with two different intuitions.
Yeah, so you've basically got two intuitions. If this principle that you like leads to this conclusion, but this conclusion negates something that you believe, then you've got a choice of either kind of changing the conclusion that you believe or changing the principle. And it's not obvious how much weight you should give to either of them, but John Rawls' idea is if you just kind of do it enough, you just get this kind of balance, and eventually you just kind of trust your intuitions to eventually get you to a pretty firm place. So I think that's what's going on in that vegan conversation. So this idea of kind of having a principle, and if you don't hold to it always, you're not a principled person. Well, look, this isn't a problem for veganism. This is a problem for ethical thought in general.
Yeah, no, that's fair enough. All right, next question. So, since studying theology, are you now more or less convinced of theism, and why?
I think I'd say I more or less remain in the same place. Whereas before, I would have said that I'm an atheist, defined as kind of a lack theist here. I don't believe that God exists because I see no good reason to think he exists. I don't think there's any good reason to think that God exists. The reasons that have been put forward, the arguments and stuff, they don't work. They've got holes in them, whatever. But we don't have strong reason to think that God does not exist either. And so I was kind of sat on this fence of agnostic atheism. Now I'd say I still sit in this roughly the same position. I'm still an atheist, but now it's because there's like an equal breeze pushing in both directions. So I'm still in this position of being an atheist that is kind of sat on this fence, as it were. But whereas before it was because I thought there were no good arguments. Well, there were like okay arguments, but no successful arguments, let's say, either way. I now think that there are good arguments one way, good arguments the other way, and they kind of press up against each other with equal force, such that I'm still in the same position, but for a different reason. I would say that I'm maybe slightly more leaning towards positive atheism due to the fact that, like, going through years and years, not just in like tutorials and lectures and stuff, but also just like with friends, talking back and forth about these minute philosophical positions and theology and all of this kind of stuff. People dedicate their lives to doing PhDs on the most kind of specific areas of theologies of a specific religion from a specific time period even. And I think to myself, well, if there was a God and he wanted us all to know him, like, is this what he'd want us to be doing? Would he want us to be sat around nitpicking about the nuances of theology? I mean, maybe there's something to be said for like trying to more fully understand the truth of God and reveal his beauty in more detail. But half of the arguments that you have, you start kind of, especially in the more abstract areas of philosophy, you're talking about, oh, does the ontological argument presuppose the existence of Platonic forms and stuff like this, where you think to yourself, surely this isn't what God would intend for his creatures. And it makes me think that maybe if the only way of kind of getting me to consider theism as true, without a religious experience, which is something I haven't had before, if the only way to really get there would be through all this philosophizing, but it seems like such a crude way to have your chosen apes come to believe in God. Maybe there's something that kind of doesn't feel right about that. So like in my heart of hearts, something pushes me towards the idea that maybe there's no God, but I wouldn't like intellectually defend that position. I'd rather stay on the kind of agnostic atheist plane.
See what you mean. Like in the same vein, when I was debating Cameron Bertuzzi, looking into the literature relating to causal finitism in relation to the Kalam, some people were saying like this is your opportunity to be saved, and I just remember reflecting, going, just how ludicrous the idea is that it's causal finitism that I need to be convinced of to get to heaven. It's like,
yeah,
you take like the Pascalian, like Liz Jackson kind of view. I'm like, what's the probability?
Yeah,
that God, that I'm just like,
of course, like
this is just
it might be the case that God kind of meets you where you're at, right?
Yeah.
So like, depending on the kind of person you are, if you're someone who's not interested in philosophy, if you're somebody who just kind of lives their life like not really caring about thinking about like abstract concepts, because they're just like, what's the point? A lot of people hate philosophy. They think it's just kind of chin stroking when you should be living practically. Maybe if that's who you are, then God will reveal himself to you via a religious experience, or maybe he'll make you of the psychological constitution that you're convinced by practical, pragmatic approaches to religion or something. Whereas if you are the kind of person that we are, which is like pedants, we sit around and we nitpick and we try to kind of break down arguments, and we're interested in validity and logic and this kind of stuff, then maybe it makes sense that this is where God would meet you in this particular hole that you've dug yourself into. Because if you spend your life digging a bit here, digging a bit there, digging a bit there, then if God's looking at you and that's how you live and says, well, where can I place myself to reveal myself to Steve? Maybe the best place would be in one of those little holes, and maybe that would be somewhere causal finitism.
I think there's legs on that. I think fair enough. How that would gel with, say, my other issues with like grotesque suffering and whatnot, I don't know. There's a question to be had there, but no, fair enough. I think that's good. Talking of Platonic forms, do you believe in them?
No.
So universals, abstracta, don't exist.
No, I think I may be committed partly due to this rejection of the idea of forms to mereological nihilism, the view that like things don't exist as distinguishable objects except insofar as the human mind distinguishes them. So like the reason that this thing is a table and this thing is a microphone, even though they're kind of connected and they seem to be kind of the same material if you looked at it for the first time, we distinguish between them basically in our mind. If the kind of Humean Adam, David Hume imagines Adam like the first man looking at, in the problem of induction, he considers Adam looking at some water and says that Adam wouldn't know without experience that water is nutritional or quenches thirst. If you took that Humean Adam and placed him in this room and said like, how many objects are there like in front of you, it's unclear how many he'd count, because you've got the table and then you've got this cup on it and you've got this other cup on it. We've got a little interface. I don't know if the camera can see it. We've got the microphones attached. And why would someone who had no experience of anything, didn't know what a table was, didn't know what a cup was, why would they separate the cup from the top of the table, but not the top of the table from the legs of the table? Why would that be all part of the table? Why not like this part of the wood from this part of the wood? It all seems contiguous. So the only thing that really distinguishes them is the mind. And you could say, well, it's because you can lift the cup up, but like I could break the table in half. It's like, obviously though, the stuff exists in my view, right? Like this cup does actually exist. It's just that without the human mind, there'd just be nothing to call it a cup, right? But
so it's not that it's not cup exists as a concept. And it's not that, say, number 3 exists. It's rather, and it's because the Platonic disposition would say 3 exists and it's manifested in these items here. You would be, it sounds a nominalist and just reject that.
So it's the idea that there's like a form of a cup, because it's the problem of the one and the many. It's like, I mean, if this is a cup and this is a cup, like why? I mean, they're made of different material, they're different shapes, they're different sizes, they're different dimensions, and sure, okay, they both have like a round top, but you could imagine one with a square top or something. It'd still be a cup. It's like, why are they both cups? And the only explanation seems to be that they both participate in some form of cupness, right? So there's this ideal cup. And I don't mean like a maximally great cup or something. I just mean as in like the idea of a cup, and that like exists somewhere, somehow, and that these all kind of participate in it, right? Okay, fine. But maybe another explanation is that like these are both cups because we've decided that they are. People criticize this view because they say, well, if this is only a cup because we've decided it's a cup, then if all human beings died, then the cup doesn't exist. That's not quite true, because well, we spoke about this at dinner the other day, but like if you ask me, does this cup exist if everyone dies, I'll say yes, because in that very sentence, when you ask the question, will that cup still exist, what you mean by that cup is like the mereological simples currently arranged, what we would consider to be cup-wise. That's a word that is used in this literature. Like, this isn't a cup, this is like some simple matter, whatever the fundamental matter of the universe is, arranged cup-wise, and we kind of put that
call
label around
that
it.
cup.
Yeah. So in the question, you say, would that cup still exist? Well, that cup just translates as, mereological simples arranged cup-wise. Would that still exist when we die? Yes. So the cup will still exist when we die.
Mm-hmm.
It's just that the only thing that defines it as a cup, as a separable object from the table or from me or from anything else in the universe, is the human mind. It's quite an unintuitive view, but I think it's at the very least consistent and probably correct if naturalism is true. The only place that maybe a Platonic form of realms or something like it could exist, in my view, is maybe in the mind of a god. So if you're a theist, I think you can say, no, these do both participate in something like the form of a cup, and that form does exist, and it exists in the mind of God. Fine. So there's maybe actually an argument for or against God to be made there. It's like an argument from the existence of God, from the existence of cups, Yeah,
so that's interesting, because
I think that might work.
Good, yeah. So the emphasis on naturalism, it being less likely to have Platonic forms, I agree with you broadly. The other thing is that where I've over the years went from thinking that there's objective morality to basically anti-realism, it's put me in a position where the only way I can really conceive of an objective morality in the way that most people mean it. Like, I would prefer to redefine objective. I think there's a way that you can do that that's very consistent. But the way that most people define objective morality, I think that the only way you could do that is have it as a Platonic form. And because I don't believe in theism, I actually think that it's even less likely that that's true.
Yeah.
So yeah, I see where you're coming from with the naturalism emphasis being a bit more easily compatible with.
Definitely. I think some people might want, there are various objections people could think
of.
They might say well, the thing that makes it a cup is to do with its history. So it's not just the fact that we right now consider it to be a cup, but the fact that it was made with that function in mind, or that intention. Well, like if the reason this is a table and this isn't is because this has the function of holding things up, then, if we all died and an alien species came down and sat on it, does it become a chair? Well, maybe yes. But then that kind of supports my view that the definition of what it is dependent upon the mind. Maybe it's not what the function is that it serves, but the function that it was created to serve. That's what makes it the thing. And then but then you've got a bit of a problem, because if somebody designed this to be a chair, is this just a bad chair? Because
I'd say it depends on one's butt. If aliens have a butt that can fit pretty well in there, then
If this was designed, let's say it's designed for humans to sit on. Say I was going to design a chair, and I gave you this with this material, everything, like it's very flimsy, and you said, well, that's not a chair. I'm like, why not? You're like, because you can't sit on it. And I'm like, well, because if the objection is like, well, what makes something a cup or a table is not what the function it serves, which I've already responded to, but rather the function that it was intended to have. Then you'd be committed to the view that this is a bad chair. Agreed. Rather than being a good cup, it would be a bad chair. But that seems very unintuitive too. So, okay, maybe that's a bit arbitrary as well.
Definitely get where you're going.
There are ways you can potentially try and object to what I'm saying, but I do think ultimately, if you're a naturalist or you don't believe in Platonic forms, there's nothing to say that this is a cup and that this is not, except our minds.
Brilliant. Okay, so in the interest of time, I've got one more question. And for those watching, if you want me to have more conversations with Alex, let us know in the comments. Show us some of the questions that you have, reveal them, and hopefully we can do it again, because you coming down to Portsmouth is always fun. Okay, I want to talk necessary being, contingency. I want to go to that realm. So a necessary being is something that exists in all possible worlds, whereas contingent beings are seen as things that don't exist in all possible worlds. All possible worlds meaning all states of affair.
That's
right?
Well, all logically consistent.
Logically,
But that's like the modal way of putting it. You can also say a necessary being is like something that can't fail to exist. So if you don't like the language of possible worlds, you can just say that like a necessary thing is something that has existence as part of its essence for some reason, for some fact of what it is, cannot fail to exist.
Yes, and like this can be fleshed out, as it often is in the literature, with the principle of sufficient reason. And I'm wondering, what's your view on the principle of sufficient reason, and like where does it bring you in terms of a necessary being?
So this will be in service of something like a contingency argument for the existence of God. Okay. So the argument will run that there are basically two states of affairs that things can have. They can either be contingent or necessary. For something to be contingent, it means that it can be true or false, or exist or not exist. Something necessary, it either has to exist and can't fail to exist, or has to not exist. So, this cup exists, but it's a contingent fact that this cup exists because it could not exist.
As long as Spinoza's wrong, necessitarianism.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. So there are some people who reject this, but then, the whole contingency argument would crumble on those grounds.
You get modal collapse, which is pushed across as some bad thing. I'm not so sure
I'm going to present something like a modal collapse, but rather than saying it's because I believe that everything is necessary, it'll be for a slightly different reason, but I'll present that in a moment. I just want, because I know you're familiar with this, but just in case the people watching.
Of course, yeah.
So the cup exists, but it could not exist. Like, there's a possible world, which is like, it could have been the case that this universe existed just as it is, except this cup doesn't exist, or this cup is blue, or something like that. Like, that's logically possible. That's a thing that could have happened. So this is a contingent fact. Whereas there's no possible world in which you have a square circle or a married bachelor, because of the fact that that's just like logically incoherent.
But okay, so
it couldn't be made to be the case.
Absolutely, but the examples you give there are analytical. They're not synthetic, as would be expressed by Hume. So if you're going to say there's a necessary being, it's not going to be an analytical statement like a married bachelor. It's going to be something that is synthetic.
Well,
right?
It depends who you ask, right?
I see.
So,
Okay, cool.
An ontological argument will make the case that it's analytically true that God exists, because kind of God just contains existence. I mean, we spoke about the ontological argument in our previous discussion on my channel.
Good fun.
So there are people who would say that, like, one of the reasons, so this is the approach that Descartes took. He thought the reason he can be so certain that God exists is because it's analytically true that God exists, because God by definition possesses all perfections, including existence. So when you say God, you're talking about something that exists. So when you say God exists, that's just analytically true.
But then, of course, you have Kant swinging in and saying, no, he's made a mistake here, because God is a thing. He's not like some analytical proposition. He's a thing. And so he's actually making a move, a foul of a type. So what I'm really interested in is, like, do you think that there's a necessary thing?
Okay, so I'll tell you why I think that the principle of sufficient reason can't bring us to a necessary being in the way that people think it is, the contingency argument. The objection that I would add on here is one of modal fatalism, which comes from Peter van Imwagen, which is that essentially the idea is necessary things can't sufficiently explain contingent things, because sufficient explanation is the same thing as entailment. If P sufficiently explains Q, but P doesn't entail Q, there's a problem. Because if P doesn't entail Q, it means that P and not Q can be true, and P and Q can be true. If there's no entailment, both of those can be true. So if we say that P sufficiently explains Q, but P does not entail Q, it can be simultaneously true that P sufficiently explains Q, but it doesn't explain why it's the case that not Q. This is getting complicated. Let me write it down.
It is. Go for it.
Okay. So I'm going to invent some notation here.
Sure.
The squiggly line means sufficiently explains, whereas traditionally the straight arrow means entails. So we have P and Q. So P sufficiently explains Q. I'm trying to say that is the same thing as P entailing Q.
Okay.
The way I'm going to prove that is by saying, let's assume that's not the case and see where we end up. So if it's not the case that P entails Q, what it means, if we have not the case that P entails Q, then what we have is the possibility for P and Q to be true. We also have the case for P and not Q to be true. I'm going to explain this one more time to the camera. So if it's not the case that P entails Q, then P and Q can be true, and P and not Q can be true. Because Q could be true or false. If P is true, because
it's not entailed.
That's right. Like, if P entails Q, then only P and Q can be true. If P is true, Q must be true. If it doesn't entail Q, then P can be true and Q can be false. That's fine. So here's the issue, right? If you say P sufficiently explains Q, but yet it doesn't entail Q, it means both of these can be true.
So it's worth expanding on what you mean by sufficiently explained.
I just mean, like, leaves no more room for explanation. Like, leaves nothing left to be explained as to why something is the case. Something's only a sufficient explanation.
Full explanation.
A full explanation.
So a necessary explanation. Because you said earlier that if it has to reference something in the chain, then it's not really a sufficient explanation. I'd be careful with the terminology.
I wouldn't like to use the word necessary there. I think it suffices for our purposes just to say that a sufficient explanation is such that if there's anything left to be explained as to why something is the case, it's not a sufficient explanation.
Which it seems that, as you were saying earlier, that would be a necessary.
But this is kind of the point, which is that if it's not the case that P entails Q, then if P is true, Q could be true or it could be false.
Yes.
Right? Because P doesn't entail Q. So if P is true, Q can be true, Q can also be false. But let's say now, so we'll prove this by reductio, P sufficiently explains Q, but P doesn't entail Q.
Yeah.
That means P sufficiently explains Q, and Q is also true, but we haven't explained why it's the case that not Q is false.
Yes.
We haven't explained why this is actually, because if P sufficiently explains Q, that means that P is true and Q is true. So this one's the one that's actually true in reality.
Yeah.
Right? But if it doesn't entail it, we still need an explanation as to why this one isn't the case. Okay, so all of this weird kind of inventing logical symbols and stuff is to essentially say that if P sufficiently explains Q, then P entails Q, right? So that was kind of the principle this is all based upon. So why is it the case that a necessary thing cannot be an explanation of a contingent thing? Well, because a contingent thing can fail to be true. But if it's sufficiently explained by a necessary thing, then it's entailed by the necessary thing. And if something's necessarily true and entails something else, that something else will be necessarily true as well.
You're a necessitarian.
Well, see, I'm not, because I'm not saying that there is a necessary being that does cause things to occur. If you were, then yes, you'd be a necessitarian.
Got you.
All I'm saying is that if the principle of sufficient reason relies upon the idea that ultimately contingent things are explained by something necessarily true, that is conceptually incoherent. Yeah. A necessary thing cannot explain contingent things.
Oh, okay.
Because they're not contingent anymore, right? So if a necessary thing fully explains something, that thing cannot be contingent. Likewise, if a contingent thing is explained by something, that thing cannot be necessary. And so if the principle of sufficient reason is the argument that contingent things must be explained by a necessary thing, that just can't be the case. Either you're not talking about contingent things, or there's no sufficient explanation. It's either not sufficiently explained, or you're not talking about contingent things at all.
Yeah. Okay, great. Fairly certain I'm on the same page. Yes, I would agree with you there. And I think Graham Oppy and others have expressed this as well. It's that, if you have a necessary being, it entails that necessitarianism is true. And that strikes me as correct as well. And I guess that's an objection that you would throw to proofs and to others that believe in a necessary being, but also contingent beings. And you would say, like, how do you deal with this issue?
I said that this argument came from Peter van Inwagen. Peter van Inwagen produces this argument, but he does produce a potential counterexample, because the argument that necessary things can't cause contingent things relies upon this premise that sufficient explanation has to also entail. So if something sufficiently explains something else, it has to also entail it. Van Inwagen gives the counterexample of free will, which of course isn't a problem for us because we don't believe in free will. Yep. But if you do believe in free will, then when somebody kind of performs a free action, it seems to be sufficiently explained why that thing occurred. It's because the person chose to do it. That's the sufficient explanation, but it doesn't entail that it happened. So if you're going to be in favor of like free will, and you think there's some kind of mysterious way in which things can explain why something happened but not entail it, then maybe there's room for the PSR to still work. But that's basically, I think that's basically all there is, right? Yeah. Like without that, and that's just kind of proof by counterexample, and we don't even think the counterexample works. Which, by the way, I'd also say that if you are convinced of what I'm saying here, I haven't explained it very well. Maybe I'll do a video on it or something. But if you are convinced that to sufficiently explain Q must also entail Q, this might also preclude free will for the same reason.
It might be some of the price tag that you buy for it.
Yeah, so Van Inwagen thinks that the PSR suffers from this modal collapse, but or modal fatalism. Modal fatalism is in that, like, if something sufficiently explains, it must also entail it. But he thinks that a potential counterexample is free will here. So that might work for you as a listener if you believe in libertarian free will. We don't, so it doesn't for me. So to answer your question, do I think a necessary being exists? At least you framed it like, do you like the PSR? Do you think it gives us a necessary being? No, I don't think it does for those reasons. There are, of course, other ways to get to necessary
and to
being.
be clear, you don't believe in a necessary being, or you do?
I guess I'm like agnostic on the question, because there are other ways to get to necessary beings.
Hold your feet to the fire. Where are you going?
I think, gosh, I really don't know. I really don't know.
Truly agnostic on this proposition.
Yeah, like I don't even know which way I sway. You'd have to, because I think the PSR fails. I think you'd need, you would need a different argument to establish a necessary being, such as an ontological argument. And I'm a bit agnostic on those too, so I don't really know what I think ultimately about it. But
that's fair enough, man. I mean,
but that's why at least I think the PSR doesn't give us a necessary being.
It's good stuff. As you said, like, I reckon you should create a video on that. It's really interesting stuff.
Because people might think that I've just kind of like waved about some letters and symbols in their face, but read Van Inwagen's paper if you like. That will give you, like, if someone's thinking, if there's like a theist out there thinking of like responding to my objections here, like, I'm not the best person to respond to, certainly not in the way that I presented it here. Go and read Van Inwagen's paper and respond to that instead.
Absolutely, it's great stuff. Well, I'll end it there. That was great fun, and hopefully we'll do it again. So if you're watching, well, cheers, you've watched all the way to the end. That's always good for the algorithm.
It's like product placement.
It's product placement. People are going to think that we're sponsored by Costa for this one.
Wouldn't that be nice?
It would be good, yeah. But yeah, thank you for tuning in. And, well, is there anything you want to say?
Yeah, so basically, I'm kidding.
What you want to do is you want to write down here going, so, you know what, I got you. Okay. Do you want to go, so, here's a possible world, okay? And we're going to have this lovely little arrow that you do, and that means go subscribe to him, okay? And you've got to do it in all possible worlds. So,
I have one more little deduction to make. So we'll take P.
Mm-hmm.
There's P written down. We're going to put a constant in. We're going to call it A. Actually, we'll add a few more constants. So we'll go TREON. I'm going to say that sufficient explanation is now represented by a slash.
That's good.
By a dot.
Yes, good.
We'll put some more variables in here.
Yep.
Then we'll put the slash. Then we'll put some more variables in.
It's good stuff.
And we end up with...
Look at that.
With that.
Magic.
So make of that what you will as well.
Yeah. Read into what you want.
Yeah, that's all I've got.
All right. Thanks for coming, dude.
Of course.
Awesome.
Good.